All right, Wilfrid Laurier is elected. Imperialism, French English split. You have to understand, ever since Confederation actually occurred, the French and the English have been fighting. In fact, they've been fighting previously to Confederation. So when Laurier is elected, it's just a natural progression that the two sides cannot agree on what's happening. Laurie's elected in 1896, and it ended 20 years of conservative power in Canada. It also brought Canada its first French Canadian Prime Minister. This extremely pleased Quebecers, as they now feel that they have more of a say because the leader of the country is from Quebec. They wanted a government that would protect the French language, culture, and Roman Catholic rights. It's interesting that they're all happy about that back in 1896, and it's still something today that they are trying to protect the language and culture. French English relations had always been a problem in Canada, but they had reached new levels with the execution of Louis Riel. You have to understand that the French supported Louis Riel and the Métis for standing up for their rights, whereas the English parts of Canada absolutely hated Louis Riel and what he stood for. And part of the Manitoba Act that guaranteed education in French and English was a part of this whole ordeal. The French felt that the English had been taking too many rights and privileges, and that French culture needed to be protected, and they were willing to do almost anything to keep that protection. Conflict and compromise. Laurier was interested in promoting national unity and to protect Canadian interests abroad. He wanted a nation that was united with both French and English speaking citizens. You have to understand, he was trying his best to unite these two sides, but these two sides never really wanted to get along in the first place. It was the violation of the Manitoba Act, where English only education was developed, that helped Laurier win the election in 1896. Because English only education was being promoted in Manitoba, it went against the Manitoba Act, and the people in Quebec were really upset about this, and Laurier ran on an election platform that he was going to correct this. Macdonald refused to intervene in the situation, and therefore he loses the election because of this. Imperialism of French English split. You have to understand, during this time period around the world, colonialization was going on. And one of the biggest countries that had colonies was Britain. And throughout this time period, Britain got itself into many different battles and fights in order to keep their colonies. And Canada, thanks to it being part of the Commonwealth, was pretty much forced to be involved either with supplying men to fight in it or to give money towards the Navy to help protect Canada. They've always been difficult. Most English were loyal to their mother country in Britain and her empire, while most French felt that they had no connection anymore with Britain. Since we became our own country, we don't need Britain anymore. And you have to understand, the French have always felt a disconnect towards Britain. They've never trusted it and never felt that they were being treated fairly by the British. Those loyal to the empire were obviously called imperialists. As a result of Canada being a British colony and then the British protectorate, Canada always had relied on Britain for naval and military support. So whenever Canada felt threatened, it was the British that came and bailed their butts out. It had nothing to do with the Canadians. They relied so heavily on the British Navy and armed forces. In fact, Canada doesn't even have a navy at this point. And you think by having two coasts and in the north that we'd have our own navy, but at this point in Canadian history, we didn't have our own navy. Many viewed military affairs as a responsibility of the British Imperial government in London, but then, so what they're trying to say is, oh, the British should protect us, but we want more freedom from Britain. We don't want Britain to control us. We don't want to get involved in any British activities overseas, when they wanted one thing and then said they wanted something completely different. Most English-speaking Canadians were still proud to be British subjects under the Crown. This was the case. They were glad that Britain needed help, etc. Like the example, the Boer War, that, hey, you know what, Britain needs help, we're going for it. People shared the idea of expanding the British Empire through imperialist ways, because the more the empire expanded, the more new raw materials they were able to get, and also the more markets for Canadian goods to be sold out were there. Most French-speaking Canadians did not care for the British Empire. Many were descendants of New France, and the people who settled it 200 years earlier, they saw themselves as Canadians, not British subjects. The French tended to be nationalists and not loyal to the crown. And they were disappointed in the decision to send troops to the Boer War, which we'll discuss later. Language rights continued to be an issue in Canada. French lost the right to French instruction in Manitoba and then Alberta and Saskatchewan. You have to realize that the Métis people were the original people to settle in this area. They were French and original. So many of the people who were settling these areas originally, the Métis, were French speaking, but as the English settlers came in and started to outnumber them, the French Métis lost many of their rights. Henry Bourassa stated that maybe Canadians would be better off without Canada because their rights as a minority were not being protected as promised at Confederation. So here's Henry Bourassa in around 1900 basically saying, hey, you know what, maybe Quebec needs to go on its own because they're not being protected. This is the same sentiment that has been an issue within Canada for many years now. As the 1900s approached, things began to change in Canada. The dependence we once saw was shifting to the other side. Britain was now turning to Canada for support and finance on the military front. So before Canada basically right on Britain to do everything, Britain paid for everything, Britain paid for everything. Now Britain, because it's so stretched out all over the world, doesn't have the resources itself to build a navy and protect things. So they're now relying on the colonies to help the mother country defend its interests. The South African War was also known as the Boer War. As you can see by the map here, you can see the yellow parts is what was controlled by the British, and the green spots were controlled by different countries. In fact, many of these areas were the Dutch. Canada's most important military event prior to World War I split the country along French-English lines. Obviously, the English felt, hey, we are British citizens, we are British subjects, we are from Britain descent, we need to go help out the mother country. But the French are like, yeah, why are we getting involved in a French or in a English conflict all the way on the other side of the world? Britain called on its colonies to support it. There's two views. The English saw the prestige of the British Empire and the risk supporting sending the troops out, duty for Britain, and the French sympathized with the Boers and just thought it was Canada shouldn't get involved in an unjust war. Laur decided to compromise by announcing instead of actually sending people, people could volunteer to go, and each one of those people that volunteered to go, the Canadian government would support them, transport them, and give them what they needed. In fact, Canada sent approximately 7,300 volunteers and spent nearly $3 million on the war that didn't directly involve Canada. Laur's compromise upset French Canadians. Henry Bourassa led the opposition to Laur's decision. Laur was just, hey, you know what? We're not going to force people to go. If people want to go, we'll support them. But again, that was still not enough for the French to be happy. The naval issue in Canada. You have to understand, Canada did not have its own navy and it relied on the British to support us. French, English, Canadians also clashed over the naval issue. Canada had always relied on the British Navy to protect them. The German Navy was beginning to challenge the British, so the British responded by creating and launching the Dreadnought battleship. Britain asked the countries of the British Empire for money to help build these boats. You have to remember, Britain was protecting all these countries, so they thought it was only fair that they should supply money to build these. Most English Canadians were supportive of contributing money or building the ships themselves to give to Britain, while many French Canadians wanted Canada to create its own navy that would be available for Britain in time of war. This is happening around 1902-1903, and in fact, when World War I breaks out in 1914, Canada still at that time did not have its own navy. Naval Services Act was introduced to create a Canadian Navy that would be lent to the British in time of emergency. That was again another compromise by Laur, going, okay, you know what, we'll have our own Navy, but when Britain needs it, we're going to give it to them. While being constructed, the British lent Canada two cruisers, the Niobe on the east and the Rainbow for the west. Heaven forbid they didn't actually construct the boats, and as I say, when World War I starts, Canada still has those two obsolete ships as its navy. Canada called the proposed navy a tin pot navy because it was just going to be nickel and dimed. Okay, and the French felt that it still tied Canada to British imperialist policy. So as you can see, no matter what they did, they could not please either side. It's one of those things where no matter what you do, you're in trouble. So Laur was trying his best, but again, he was still upsetting many, many people. The Alaska boundary dispute. So when Alaska was bought by the United States, there was still a colony of British Columbia, and then it became the area. But there was no actual border for Alaska and what becomes British Columbia. So as you can see in this picture here, you can see the dotted lines are the Alaska boundary dispute. You can see where each the U.S. claimed and Canada claimed. The big reason Canada was disputing this is because at this time the Yukon Gold Rush was going on, and many of the sailors or many of the people that were going there were coming through there, but the Canada could not get its militia or RCMP up there to help protect and enforce laws. They in fact had to ask permission to go through U.S. territory to get to the Yukon. All right, 1867, the U.S. buys Alaska from Russia, and the exact boundary was not notified. It stretches from what is Alaska to Prince William Island in the south. So basically, it's called the Alaska Panhandle. So when you look at the state of Alaska now, it looks like it's got a little handle, and that's what stretches down into northwest British Columbia. Entering points to the Yukon were the fjords and inlets, but Canadian authorities had to ask permission to send police and militia through there, making it difficult to police the Yukon. If the Americans didn't want the Canadian militia or RCMP to go through, there's nothing the Canadians could do. Laur was anxious to settle it, so a tribunal was set up in 1903. There were 6 judges that would decide this. 3 U.S. judges, and you'd think there'd be 3 Canadian judges. However, because technically we're the area and Canada was still a British entity, there was 1 British judge and 2 Canadian judges. Theodore Roosevelt, the President of the United States at the time, basically stated that this is going to favor the U.S. side. And international politics played the role in the final decision, and the British judge ends up favoring with the U.S. So here we are. We are part of the British Commonwealth, and the British government sells us down the river over this land dispute. And what ends up happening is the Americans put pressure on the British, because the British at this time period needed all the help they can get economically and things like that. So the U.S. put pressure on the Britain to side with them in this dispute in order to keep their relations going well. Okay, and because of the Confederation Act in 1867, Canada still technically was part of Britain, could not actually sign its own treaties. This is a huge issue. So Canada can negotiate and do whatever it wants, but if Britain doesn't want to support it, Canada can't happen. The Gold Rush also helped establish Yukon territory by having more and more people go here. Reciprocity. Reciprocity is an exchange or sharing. Western farmers became tired of paying higher costs of goods from Ontario and Quebec than those made in the U.S. Sound familiar to something going on today? The farmers convinced the Liberals to negotiate a reciprocity agreement with the U.S., reducing tariffs on U.S. goods. Basically, they wanted access to American goods, so they convinced the Liberals to reduce tariffs so they could access goods. Canadian business leaders and nationalists came together to fight this. They were ticked off royally. The business owners feared cheaper goods would put them out of business. The railway feared the loss of east-west transport because many of the goods would be coming north-south. Nationalists thought Canada resources should stay in Canada, so they should be selling to Canada first and then anybody else second, and reminded voters that the U.S. still wanted to take over Canada. So what happens is the Conservative Party is able to convince people that, hey, this is not good. The reciprocity agreement sucks. Let's get rid of it. So in 1911, the Liberals under Laur lost the election because of this issue. Think about it today. This issue, is this still an issue in Canada today? East versus West, right? Here is the Western farmers wanting to do something better for themselves, but the people in the East not wanting it. And guess what? People in the East win. Meanwhile, the people in the West are going, yay, we're screwed. We're not going to be able to make as much money. It's going to be harder for us to survive. And even look at people today when it comes to gas, milk, cheese products, eggs, things like that. People still see it cheaper in the U.S. and go down across the line all the time for goods. So this isn't just an issue from over 100 years ago. These are still issues today that many business people, many in Canada, still face today. Thanks very much, and I will see you in class tomorrow.